The next meeting in Philadelphia in 1787 was intended to be a revision of the Articles of Confederation, but they decided that there was simply too much wrong, and they would end up drafting an entirely new constitution. When the 55 men who participated in the Constitutional Convention arrived in Philadelphia, they generally represented an elitist point of view. They were far wealthier than the average American and tended to be very highly educated for their times. And Americans were generally better educated than the people who lived in Europe, but overall education levels were still pretty low, especially in rural areas and in the South. Many of the men who participated in this Constitutional Convention had been members of the Continental Congress or the Confederation Congress. Many of them had participated in writing their state constitutions, and several had even signed the Declaration of Independence or had other government experience. Some of the well-known participants of the Revolution were present, including Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Dickinson, and Alexander Hamilton. Others were not present, though, either because they were away on government business, like John Adams, who was minister to Britain, and Thomas Jefferson, who was minister to France, or they did not participate by choice or because they weren't chosen as delegates, and this included men like Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock. The purpose of the convention had been to revise the Articles of Confederation, but since one state, Rhode Island, had not sent any delegates at all, fearing an increase in federal power, it would prove to be impossible to just revise the Articles because all 13 states would be needed to approve any changes. So the delegates decided to come up with an entirely new governmental structure. It was not too difficult to come up with the whole concept of the division of powers into a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary, as all the states had a similar division. Some of the biggest issues were actually more along the lines of how much power each division would have, or each branch, as they're called, would have, and how their power could be checked. Several of the plans for the basic structure of government were proposed, with the Virginia plan, developed by James Madison, being used for the main framework, which called for a two-house Congress with apportionment, meaning the number of votes in that chamber, based on population. An opposition plan, keeping the vote based on equal representation of the states, as it was under the Articles of Confederation, was suggested by New Jersey delegates. In the end, a series of compromises called the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise, formed by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, basically blended these two plans as it applied to how apportionment in the Senate would be handled. This debate over apportionment and representation would actually represent about half of the overall time delegates spent in creating this new government framework. And in the end, it's the House of Representatives where representation will be based upon population, and the Senate will have equal representation. But since population is going to be an issue, the question comes up is, how would slaves be counted? Because you're going to need some level of determining representation in Congress by population, but will slaves count for that? Slaves represented about 1/5 of the overall U.S. population of about 4 million people total, but 90% of these slaves lived in the South. As of the writing of the Constitution, only New England had abolished slavery completely, although the other northern states would quickly be following through. Those southern states wanted their slaves to count for purposes of representation in the Congress, but did not want them to be counted for purposes of the taxes that those states would owe to this national government. Northern states wanted to count slaves for taxation, but not for representation, since a slave would not receive any of the benefits of citizenship in this society. A compromise, known as the 3/5 Compromise, was reached, which would take the interests of both regions into account. And what it was is that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for both representation as well as taxation purposes. So the South would be slightly more represented in Congress, but they would pay more for that privilege. Now, as for the slave trade, The framers knew that they were never going to be able to get a government functioning without the support of the Southern states, so they agreed to actually set this issue aside for a minimum of 20 years, after which Congress would be able to abolish the slave trade if they saw fit. And since the Constitution ultimately is going to be passed in 1788, that means that 1808 would be the earliest time at which the Congress, the United States Congress, could tackle the issue of the slave trade. And they did in that year. Still other compromises had to be reached to balance the interests of both the North and the South. The commercial compromise is another one of these. Northern states, which were beginning to see increases in manufacturing, didn't want competition from cheaper European competitors. Southern states feared that tariffs would largely affect them, as they had, few cities and conducted much of their trade abroad. They were also worried of potential to be taxed on exported staple crops that would make it difficult to sell those crops on an open market. So this commercial compromise would allow for the collection of a tax or a tariff on imported goods, but it would specifically ban taxes on exported goods, at least taxes imposed on them by the United States government. They could still be taxed by the countries that were importing the goods from the United States based on their own tariff laws. The powers in the election of an executive, the president, was also an issue. One suggestion by Alexander Hamilton had been to have the chief executive chosen for life, and he had George Washington in mind from the very beginning. Others had him chosen by the legislature, much like you would have in a parliamentary system. In the end, though, the compromise was reached that they would create a special, separate body that's going to elect the president, called the Electoral College. And each state in that Electoral College would receive the same number of electors as they had members in Congress, which includes both the House and the Senate combined. The electors would be chosen by the states, but there's no method that is specifically set up for how they had to be chosen. It was actually up to the individual states. And they would then choose the president from there. In the event that there was a tie or no electoral majority amongst the vote in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives would cast the deciding vote for president, with each state receiving just a single vote. The reasoning for conducting the presidential vote this way was that the framers didn't want the president being overly influenced by Congress, and they didn't want him to be chosen by a small, never-changing group of men in some sort of a backroom deal, nor did they want him chosen by perhaps a mob mentality of the people. Finally, since the framers knew that not all of the states had participated in the creation of the Constitution, they anticipated that there would be opposition. Rhode Island, of course, hadn't come at all, and other delegates had left early. In fact, by the time of the end of the Constitutional Convention, which was only about 18 weeks long, New York had just one delegate left. So the framers included a provision that as soon as 9 states had ratified the Constitution, it could go into effect. Almost immediately upon approval by the Constitutional Convention delegates, which happened on September 17, 1787, there would be intense debate over the document and the government that it created. 2 groups formed, one in support and one in opposition. The Federalists supported a strong central government, as the Constitution itself had created. The Anti-Federalists opposed the creation of a stronger government, fearing that it would undermine the work of the Revolution. The Anti-Federalists were overall quite a diverse group of individuals, but it was their criticism of a lack of list of protected rights, a Bill of Rights, like the state governments had, that would garner the most attention. Prominent men who supported the Federalist position included George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Prominent Anti-Federalists included men like Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee, James Monroe, and even Thomas Jefferson. To support their position, the Federalists, specifically Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, who had written much of the Constitution itself and is known as the father of the Constitution, as well as John Jay, published a series of 85 essays that appeared at the New York papers. These essays would later be collected into a book form called the Federalist Papers. The majority of these essays were written by Alexander Hamilton, with James Madison also contributing a significant amount, and Jay just a handful. These essays broke down the various parts of the Constitution and were meant to be a justification as to why those parts had been included in the Constitution in the first place, and why it was important for the states to approve the Constitution as it was written. All strong nationalists, the three men argued that, most importantly, the proposed system would preserve the Union, which was then in danger of breaking apart, and would empower the federal government to act firmly and coherently in the national interest. Conflicting economic and political interests would be reconciled through a representative Congress, whose legislation would be subject to both presidential veto as well as judicial review. This system of checks and balances in the Constitution's clear delineation of the powers of the federal government, which were few, limited, and explicitly defined, as Madison would put it, would protect states' rights and, as they saw it, individual rights. The ultimate protection of individual liberties would have to wait for later passage of the Bill of Rights, which of course was the strongest argument against this new Constitution. But for these men, as their arguments made plain, they distrusted what Madison called the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. Many of the constitutional provisions they praised were intended precisely to dampen democratic excesses or mob rule. Anticipating opposition, again, the framers had included a provision that the new government could begin operating as soon as 9 of the 13 states had approved the Constitution. In the end, the Federalists were able to win the support of several states right away, with Delaware becoming the first state to ratify the Constitution on December 7, 1787, really just a few weeks after the Constitution was finished. 5 other states followed relatively quickly, but then the ratification process slowed down. It is here that the Federalist Papers increased the frequency of their publication and saw their content published in the book form. And they were originally published in New York newspapers, but the book could be distributed elsewhere, and it was quite popularly spread throughout the states. Finally, in June of 1788, New Hampshire ratified the Constitution, becoming the 9th state to do so, which technically meant the Constitution could go into effect. But at the time, both New York and Virginia were still holding out, and as the 2 most populous states, it really wasn't going to work unless you could get them on board. It's unclear, though, how much the Federalist essays would really affect the ratification of the Constitution. What certainly seemed to have the bigger impact was the promise that the first Congress would in fact work on creating a list of rights and protected freedoms that the government could not infringe upon. With that promise of putting in a Bill of Rights, Virginia approved the Constitution next, followed by New York very quickly thereafter. So now it was clear, with 11 of the 13 states participating, that this new Constitution could work and could begin going into effect. They arranged for elections. The final 2 states, North Carolina and Rhode Island, did later accept the Constitution, with North Carolina approving it in November of 1789 and Rhode Island in May of 1790, which of course are both well after the Constitution was in effect and even after work had begun on those Bill of Rights. As promised, that first Congress did begin working on that Bill of Rights. Even though the Federalists argued that the Constitution didn't need one because the people in the states kept any powers that were not given to the federal government, they believed that the Constitution was already self-limiting. but Anti-Federalists held that a Bill of Rights was necessary to safeguard individual liberty. The House approved 17 amendments, and of these 17, the Senate approved 12 of them, so those 12 were sent to the states for their approval in August of 1789. Of those 12, 10 were quickly approved or ratified, Virginia's legislature becoming the last to ratify the amendments on December 15, 1791, which then meant that the Bill of Rights could go into effect.